I think you don't agree with me. Are you in favour of maintaining the licence fee? But more importantly, perhaps, do you think I'm wrong that the licence fee has ended up being a comfort blanket for the BBC that has kept its revenues down when other media outlets have been able to overtake it?
I don't agree with you, Jacob. No, I think that the licence fee has served the licence payer and the British Broadcasting Corporation, a great British national institution, which is regarded with enormous respect around the world. Indeed, one of the principal tools of British cultural diplomacy. I think that the licence fee may have to change. I would like to see it related to the ability to pay in future, but I would gladly pay £500 a year for my BBC access just to listen to BBC Radio 4. That's my favourite output. So I think you are wrong about that, and I think that you caricature the BBC. The BBC is a truly great cultural institution. It is revered around the world. There are people listening to BBC output in Ukraine now, in parts of the world where totalitarian governments rule, in Myanmar, for example, people who depend upon the BBC. As a young BBC journalist abroad, I remember meeting people in Ceausescu's Romania in 1989 who spoke English because they'd been listening to BBC World Service, though they'd never been able to leave their own country. So I think that you underestimate the standing of this great organisation and that you would diminish it greatly if you were to privatise it. You would also, by the way, strip many of its competitors in the UK market, commercial competitors, of advertising revenue because they would be terrified to compete for advertising revenue with the BBC, and I know because they've told me so.
But the World Service is a rather special case because up until 2010 it was funded by the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office is still parts funded. It's not mainly, and it's just got another £20 million today from taxpayers. So there is a funding mechanism beyond the licence fee for the World Service. But you made the point that you would happily pay £500 a year for Radio 4. Isn't that the point, that there are other sources of revenue and that the licence fee has actually meant the BBC doesn't have the money it needs to compete in an increasingly expensive global media market?
Well, I think that the BBC probably does need to adapt to a much more competitive market than it's been accustomed to at any time since Lord Reith famously launched it as a private company back in 1923. But I don't think that it would help the country or the BBC if the BBC were to be privatised in the way that you suggest. I think that what we are looking for is a new way of funding the BBC, which remains universal, but better related to the ability to pay. I recognise there are many people who use the BBC much less intensively than I do, and who earn a great deal less than I do. And I believe in fair taxation. I think that's a good conservative principle. And I think that people should pay...
Sorry to interrupt, but why would it be fair for somebody who doesn't watch the BBC but earns a lot of money to pay for it when you don't have to pay for Netflix if you don't watch it? You don't have to pay for Sky if you don't watch it. I don't see how fairness comes into this. That when there was only one channel, indeed, even when there were only 4 channels, almost everybody watched quite a lot of the BBC if they had a television. But that simply isn't true anymore. Lots of people with televisions will hardly watch the BBC now.
There are some institutions, Jacob, which are genuinely emblematic of British values, and I think that the BBC is one of them. I think that the BBC does deliver a lot of the impartial journalism that you say you want, but claim doesn't exist. But I hear impartial journalism on BBC channels day in, day out. I hear Conservatives being challenged robustly. I hear the opposition being challenged robustly. And what I want to avoid is the BBC becoming a punch bag in a culture war between right and left. I'm very much a moderate. I believe absolutely in fair debate. I despise the notion that we should seek to cancel people for having views with which we disagree. I am, in fact, a member of the Free Speech Union, although I consider myself to be a liberal with a small L. And for all of these reasons, I regard the BBC as an institution which, whilst it can occasionally make mistakes, and which certainly made a mistake by suspending Gary Lineker, rather than just bringing him in and telling him to abide by the editorial guidelines, which is what Tim Davies should have done in the first place. But I do believe that the BBC is a truly valuable institution, and one whose absence or privatisation would diminish us greatly. Something I can assure you that Margaret Thatcher agreed with, because although when she came to office, she was very keen to do something radical to the BBC, she very quickly recognised, although her husband Dennis kept the picture broadcasting house leaning to the left on its wall at Downing Street, that in fact the BBC was worth building. He was absolutely right.
But when she became Prime Minister, there were only 3 channels, so it's rather a different world. Look, I accept your point. There are some very impartial people on the BBC. I think the current political correspondent and his predecessor were. But Gary Lineker tweeting makes people think that the BBC backs the left. Isn't that part of the problem?
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's why it was so important that Tim Davie prevented him from continuing to tweet about issues of current party political controversy. And although Gary Lineker has not made a formal apology in public, he did thank Tim Davie for the way that he'd handled things over the weekend, and he has recognised that he must not broadcast views or tweet views.
Thank you very much, Professor Luckhurst. I'm extremely grateful.